from Ramratna International School and from different schools across the country. We are so glad to have you here on this exciting talk on this very relevant topic by Dr. Kapono. Let me formally introduce our speaker of the day, each one of you. Dr. Kapono Ciotti, the Director and Head of School at the American International School, Cairo, Egypt. Dr. is passionate about the science of teaching and learning and has put this practice to work as Director, Head of School at the American International School in Egypt. Dr. Kapono is an international trainer and professional development coach, teacher, and a culture and place-based curriculum writer, focusing on culturally appropriate pedagogy. With the Pacific American Foundation, he has written for the different curriculum like Aloha Aina and others, and facilitated numerous trainings for Department of Education, charter, independent, and international schools. He has over 12 years of classroom teaching before he has experience of over 12 years of classroom teaching before moving into senior administration in nonprofit, high school, and elementary school. He now leads one of the region's most influential K-12 institutions, AISE. Dr. Kapono 15 years as a facilitator for the National Association of Independent Schools, specializing in issues of diversity in education, and a contributor to national movements in project-based and 21st century learning. Dr. Ciotti earned a PhD in international education in 2018 from North Central University, holds a master's degree in social change and development from the University of Newcastle, Australia, and a bachelor's in language and cultural studies from the Evergreen State College, Washington. What a great privilege to have you amongst us today, sir. We will learn from sir how the assessment, which is in various ways by educators, is something which can be made authentic, how it can be made authentic, how it can be linked to the learning objectives that the teachers set at the beginning of their lessons. What is most exciting, which I personally felt about the topic sir chose, is how the assessment serve as tools for learning. Usually we hear of assessments and we talk of assessments as tools for evaluation or measurement, not as tools for learning. So this is something which is very exciting. Sir, we look forward to learning these interesting ideas from you. Over to you, sir. Once again,
thank you.
Welcome and gratitude.
It's a real privilege to be here with you all. I know that internet can be an issue. And if it is, please let me know if I'm not clear. I can always go back and say something. But right now it looks like that signal is fairly clear. Am I going to be presenting my own screen, or are we going to be presenting it from there?
So we can give you the rights to share screen. I think you can do that directly. Mr. Amit can help with the technology here. Amit sir, can sir directly share his screen? So you would see on your screen 3 dots for more options at the bottom panel.
Screen share.
Share screen.
Okay.
You may choose to share.
Let's see if this is working.
Yes.
Can you see this now?
We can see this. Right,
Excellent.
sir. We can see it.
All right. So it's a privilege to be here with you all. I'm going to try to not talk at you too much because that's kind of counter to the point of authentic assessment. My name is Dr. Kapono Ciotti. I'm the director of the American International School. And I want to make at the beginning a couple really clear points. It's not what we teach, it's what kids learn that's the most important. That's why it's important to think and stop and talk about assessment. And an educational mentor of mine, Dr. Robert G. Peters, has really impressed upon me this idea that assessment can be for learning, not just of learning. Dr. Peters has told me several times, Kapono, when the days are so few, when the months are so few, how can we even think about giving up hours, let alone weeks and months, or days and weeks, When we have kids come and take what's in their head, leave it on a piece of paper and leave it there for us. That assessments can be more than that. Assessments can be opportunities for students to continue learning and to take more away with them than they came into the assessment with. It's not what we teach, it's what students learn. The other point I'm going to make right at the beginning here is that for school systems like we have in Egypt and like you have in India, many of these things are challenging because we do have exams, baccalaureates, and exit exams that we need to prepare students for. I'm going to present to you ideas in authentic assessment, and I'm going to give you a lot of resources so that you can see how authentic assessments might work for you in your school. Why are we here? I just want to share with you a video of why I believe authentic assessment is so important. You got to let me know if you can hear and see this. It's a short video.
So we can see, but not hear.
There's no sound, huh? All right, that's not good. There we go. Is that working? No, it's not working. I'm gonna just summarize this for you because it's okay. I don't need to waste your time actually listening to other people speak. The video here is a graduation for the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I'm sure you are all very familiar with the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, one of the world's most renowned engineering schools. It's interesting that they go and they interview students that have just graduated. And they ask students, they give them a battery and they give them a light bulb and they give them a wire. And they say, do you think you can light up this light bulb with this battery and this wire? It's interesting, throughout their interviews, they actually can't find a single student who can light up the light bulb with the wire and the battery. Now, one might argue that lighting a light bulb with a wire and a battery wasn't what was taught at MIT. However, one might also argue that if you learned everything you needed to learn with an MIT degree, that the simplest thing of lighting a light bulb with a wire and a power source should be possible. Why are we here? Because it's not what we teach, it's what students learn. And if they're not learning what we want them to learn, what is the point of all the time that we put into education? So I'm going to just make the point over and over again. It's not what we teach, it's what they learn. Here's my hypothesis. I have two hypotheses for you today. Authentic assessments are concrete and tangible ways to anchor learning in complex, messy, and amazing ways. I'm not going to say that authentic assessments are clean and easy and that school administrators, district level leaders, ministries of education are going to find them easy to understand. They're not. They're complex, they're messy, and they're amazing. But authentic assessments are concrete and tangible ways that we can anchor learning and really see what students learn. My second hypothesis is that quality authentic assessments are necessary so that teachers know what students have learned, especially when we're doing remote learning. So I hope for the sake of all of us that we get back to 100% face-to-face, that we can do this. We don't know where the pandemic is, but this point is very critical for me. When we are remote, it is very hard to authenticate that the work that students have done is their own. It's very difficult to proctor learning. And the old versions of essays and final exams are much more difficult to do. Why do things that we know is not best practice that no longer work? Why not embrace things that we do know is best practice that do work in a remote environment? What is authentic assessment? Because the sound of the videos is proving to be problematic, that's okay. I would rather spend the time with you listening to me and answering questions. So what I want to do is at the very end of this, I'm going to share this video, this Google slide deck with you. What I've tried to do in the slide deck is pack it full of resources for you to take back. This video is a long video, but the first 5 minutes are very important here. It's from a site called What School Could Be, and it's about a 20 to 30 minute video explaining what authentic assessment is. I will do that for you today. You don't need to watch the video, but as you go and bring these things back to your colleagues, parents who need to be educated on this, students who need to know why we're not just preparing for a test, your administrators and people in the government, this video is very, very important. It's linked here and you'll have access to it. So what is an authentic assessment? An authentic assessment is a form of assessment in which students are asked to perform real-world tasks that demonstrate meaningful application of essential knowledge and skills. I'm going to break this down for you. It is a form of assessment. There are tons of different types of assessment. We should be doing multiple forms of assessment with our students. We should not only be doing authentic assessments. It's one of many forms of assessment that we should be using. In authentic assessment, students are asked to perform, to do with their bodies, their minds, to bring into being something that wasn't there before, a real world task that allows them to show us, demonstrate, show us meaningful application of what we were hopefully teaching them in class. And here we go back to my point. We've taught them something in class. We need to know what they've actually learned. So in an outcome of education, there's content. Content is easily measurable in multiple choice questions. There are skills. Skills can be measured in how well a student does an algorithm of math. But there's more than that. There's concepts of how the world works and complex skills like communication and collaboration and critical thinking. It is those more complex tasks, critical thinking, collaboration, creativity, communication, and the concepts of how the world works that authentic assessment is particularly good at assessing. Authentic assessment versus traditional assessment. It's good for us to parse these out, to put them in two columns so we can see. A traditional assessment, in a traditional assessment, curriculum is driving assessment. In an authentic assessment, how we see what kids learn, that's where we start, and then we back end curriculum. In traditional assessment, we are selecting a response and looking for a particular response. In authentic assessment, students are performing a task. In traditional assessment, the assessment is deliberately created to fit in a school setting. In authentic assessment, the assessment is real life. Traditional assessment, we have recall and recognition. Authentic assessment, construction and application. Teacher structured versus student structured. We encourage memorization and correct answers versus encouraging divergent thinking. A little bit more. The goal of traditional assessment is to measure the acquisition of knowledge. The goal of authentic assessment is to enhance and develop meaningful skills. Traditional assessment promotes what type of knowledge. Authentic assessment promotes how type of knowledge. We emphasize competition in traditional assessment. We emphasize cooperation in authentic assessment. Recall of lower order knowledge and skills versus applying higher order knowledge and skills. Written and oral tests versus performance examinations. Now, I hope by putting it this way, you can see that all types of assessments are required to really capture the totality of learning. When you sit through this and when we're done with this, my hope is that you don't throw out everything you did before, but you have another tool in your tool bag that can help us actually help students learn through assessment and assess higher order thinking skills that aren't being assessed in traditional assessments. I want to give you some examples. And again, what I tried to do was pack this presentation with links that you can go back to later. None of the examples I'm going to give you are perfect by any means. They're all works in progress by teachers like you, like me. We try, we put them there, we work on them. The first link here, designing a water park, takes you to a really neat project-based learning assessment that comes with tons of different slides and worksheets. And why am I sharing this with you? I'm sharing it with you because my son was actually in a class that did that. I'm sharing it with you because it's not perfect. This is a fairly low-end project-based learning. It has a fairly low-end authentic performance task with it. But even for simple tasks like the designing a water park PBL here, it can get kids engaged. My son did this while he was in quarantine 2 years ago when he was in 4th grade. And instead of me and him fighting and arguing because the work he was turning in was not high quality, he actually was crying the night before this was due, not because it was not what he wanted to do, but because he wanted more time to make it good. Because he was doing something, creating something, putting his heart and soul forward into something that was his and turning that in, he had an emotional reason as to why he wanted to do it. I'm sharing this one with you, not because it's an amazing example, because it's a simple example that you can take and customize for yourself. There's tons of different types of examples here. You can look at these. Some of these are amazing examples. Other ones are not. I'm going to actually tell you about the first two, the fish reserve and the Ebola epidemic. Why? Because I can give you an actual, real, a tangible explanation. So in the fish reserve example, I worked with a high school that decided they wanted to do authentic assessments. They took their students to a traditional ancient Hawaiian fish pond 2 days a week, and they were in school 3 days a week. They did this for a year. And at the end of the year, what they found was that the hands-on activity they did in the fish pond actually made kids hate school even more, because they were saying, well, why do we get to go to the fish pond and do learning and then come back to school and be assessed with tests and essays? At the end of that year, the teachers sat together. Teachers, not professional development coaches, not Dr. Kapono. The teachers sat together and said, we have a problem to solve. We would like to bring together the amazing place-based learning of the fish pond with the assessments that need to happen in a classroom. And they said, what could we do in the fish pond that was an assessment? I want to give you this concrete example of something you can do that's very easy. They sat around and said, well, what could students do that looks like real life? And they said an environmental impact statement. One teacher said this. The rest of the teachers said, no, this is way too complicated for 9th graders, for 14-year-olds. And the teacher that stood up said, you know what? Maybe a full governmental environmental impact statement is too complicated, but could we make it more simple? Could the introduction paragraph of a 5-paragraph essay, could we call it Introduction to Problem? Could the next 3 paragraphs in a 5-paragraph essay be one component of an environmental assessment that we think is the most important? And could the conclusion be their recommendations? Could we share these mini environmental impact statements with the nonprofit that ran the fish reserve? And could we choose an authentic audience to go along with it? I'm going to talk more about authentic audience later. My point for the fish reserve component is they didn't, in their public school setting, have the latitude, have the freedom to throw out the essay, as I believe you and the teachers at my school don't necessarily have that full freedom. Our kids need to write essays. But in this specific example, they melded the traditional essay with an authentic task that would be done in the real world. The kids were still doing a 5-paragraph essay, but they were doing so structured in the structure of a real world task. I'm going to give you one more example here, and we're going to push on, and I'm going to continue to give you resources. A colleague of mine worked with the school doing project-based learning. And this was during the Ebola epidemic of the early 2000s. Just very similar to the COVID epidemic right now. The teacher sat with the class and asked the class, what are the most important issues that real people need to know with regards to Ebola? The class came up with 2 things. One is public information on the fact that the Ebola epidemic, just because you came from Cairo or Kenya doesn't mean that you could be contagious. There was more Ebola at that point in New York City than there was in Kenya. That was one project. The other project that they came up with is how do you really protect yourself from Ebola? Because there was a lot of misinformation, specifically in countries like Liberia. The teacher used one specific technique from authentic assessment that I will share with you in a second. That specific technique was an authentic audience. And the key here is authentic audience. The teacher found a radio station in Liberia that would play the public service announcement, the little radio spot that the class presented. And the teacher said, hey class, what you present, what you create, all of your research is going to culminate into a 30-second radio advertisement. Your radio advertisement must be effective and correct, because if it's not, real people's lives are on the line. Now, of course, if it wasn't correct, if it wasn't true, she wouldn't have submitted it to be played on the radio. But because there was a real authentic audience, her students did amazing work, such amazing work that actually the radio stations played these public service announcements, these audio clips created by her class for months. We assumed that they actually saved lives because they explained how we could protect ourselves from Ebola. I want to drive home the point that authentic audiences that I'll talk about in a second are important. I'm going to drive home the point by saying the teacher went to present at a conference such as this. Just like you, she had gone through a training on authentic assessments, on project-based learning. She learned it, she did it with her class, and she went back the next year and asked her class, hey class, you know that project you did last year? Can I have your permission to share it with other adults? And you know what the class said? You have our permission, but let us make it better before you submit it and show it to other adults. How many times have we heard students tell us, not for a grade, not for points, can I redo that, mister? Can I redo that, miss? Can I redo that, doctor? Very rarely. The power of an authentic assessment with an authentic audience is it helps intrinsically motivate our students. They want to do better because it makes a difference. The product of their learning makes a difference. Again, when I share this with you at the end of this, I want you to have visuals, not just me talking about it. So I've embedded here 2 good videos. Again, not perfect videos, not great videos, not the only way to do these, but good ways where teachers around the world are using real world problems and problem solving to create authentic assessments for their students. These are 2 versions of authentic assessments that I'm going to share with you. When you have the link, you can watch on your own time, and it'll give you a visual idea of what this really looks like. Everyone has their own answer to what an authentic assessment is. There's lots of models out there. Again, this slide is there. Each of these links has multiple links. This page alone will probably take you to 100 to 500 resources about authentic assessments. From John Muller, who is an expert at this, from Edutopia, University of Wisconsin, University of Plymouth, the PL toolbox on project-based learning, as well as what schools could be that I will share with you in a little bit. They all agree on a couple things. They all agree on these 3 domains of authentic assessment. Everybody agrees that authentic assessment should have context. So there's 3 domains. 1, the context of assessment. The context of the assessment should be a realistic activity or context. The assessment should be a task that is performance-based. The assessment should be cognitively complex. The assessment should answer why is learning being presented other than for the sake of learning and the benefit of the grade. It needs to have a real impact. I'm going to go back and drive home the point on these 4. A realistic context. A quality authentic assessment would not be a Renaissance fair. This is something teachers in the United States love to do. They love to reenact the Middle Ages and the Renaissance of old Europe. That's fine. You can do it. But that's not an authentic assessment. That's a reenactment. Authentic assessments should have a performance task. We shouldn't culminate with students putting something just on paper and turning it into you and me. Students should be doing something, bringing something into being that wasn't there before. Authentic assessment should be cognitively complex. For a kindergartner, creating a diorama in a shoebox might be complex. It is not complex for somebody 12, 13, 14, 15, 18-year-old to be creating a diorama. We need to have a high bar of cognitive complexity. And there needs
Dr.
to be...
Kapono,
Yes.
Dr. Kapono, I
Yes.
would request you to please copy and paste these links in the chat box if possible.
So I shared I shared this whole presentation with I forget who it was.
Okay, sure. Mr. Amit.
We can share it out now if you want, so people can navigate the links. Or we can share it later on at the end. Hold on. So, oops, wait. All right. So the next thing that everybody agrees upon is that students should have a role. That students, part of the role of students is that they should defend the answer or the product. And this is why this is important during COVID times. We need to know that students really did the work. And if we're online, having students do a multiple choice test at home, even write an essay at home, it's hard to know that students actually did it themselves. In an authentic assessment, part of the assessment is students defending their work like we would a master's degree or a doctorate degree. We need to sit with somebody and verbally or in writing say how we know what we know and why it's important. The assessment is also part of the learning. In Hawaiian, we say makahana ka'ike, in the doing is the learning. And so here, this point says that the process of doing authentic assessments is not just pen to paper, here teacher, here's what I learned. By doing the assessment, students are still learning. By listening to other people's presentations, they are still learning. Students need to collaborate with each other and with the teacher or community partners. A very high bar is that we bring community partners into our school or send students out. That doesn't always need to happen. Students can collaborate with each other or with teachers or other people on campus. And scoring, everybody also agrees that scoring criteria should be known by the students ahead of time, or maybe even developed with the students' participation. There should be multiple indicators with multiple things that we're assessing, and the performance expectation is mastery, not just yes.
Sorry, we lost you for a few seconds there.
Thank you for letting me know. The 3 points for scoring that everybody agrees upon is that the scoring criteria should be known ahead of time. Authentic assessment should have multiple components or multiple facets to it, and that the expectation is mastery. I'll share a little bit more about this in a second. So I have articulated this in 3 different ways. One is authentic assessment should have kids doing, creating, and bringing into being something that wasn't there before. Authentic assessments should make real impacts that will last beyond the due date of the project. And authentic assessments should have teachers as coach and the students as a player and the real audience, a real audience that cares but doesn't assess. And I'll talk about this in a second. This is a tool that I want to leave you with. This is in the slide deck, and I will show you how to use this right now. This is a performance task or authentic assessment creator. There's 2 ways to use this template. The way I like to use this template is to start in the middle with those 4 boxes that intersect in the middle. But you can start anywhere. I would start with real world problem or challenge. Can we define a real world problem or challenge that we're asking our students to address through the subject matter of our class? For example, with the Ebola example I gave you, that was a social studies class. And so what they needed to do is look at social issues. And so we define the real world problem. From there, I would go to the gray box, the real world audience. This for me is key that many people who talk about authentic assessments and performance tasks misses. An authentic audience allows the teacher to be the student's coach. This you have in most systems in India, in Cairo, in England, when you have this external exam. We don't have this in the United States. In the United States, the teacher is the assessor. There is no external exam except the SAT that comes in their junior year, right before they graduate. We really value in the United States the teacher as coach. And while you have that in an international baccalaureate or an Indian setting or an Egyptian setting, American teachers don't. What we ask in a great authentic assessment is that we find somebody outside of the 4 walls of the classroom who cares about what students produce. They don't have to assess it. They don't have to give points to it. But for students to sit over and over and over again, to present the same thing 30 times, 20 times, and hear their classmates presenting the same thing to each other and the teacher is redundant and boring. How might we choose a real audience, like in the Ebola example, where we were putting it on the radio in a real country where real people impacted by Ebola would listen to it? Those people didn't grade the assessment, but they were really impacted. How might we send the 5-paragraph essay to a nonprofit who needs the information from the 5-paragraph essay, and we call it an environmental impact statement? How might we do that? Those people weren't grading it. They don't have time to do it. But how might we find an authentic audience outside of the 4 walls of our classroom? For little kids, that might look like 2nd graders teaching, or 7-year-olds teaching 5-year-olds a concept in math. Their authentic assessment might be to create a lesson, simplifying a concept to teach to a grade below them. A real world process is the green box there. And the real world process says that whatever we ask students to do should follow what real people do in the real world. If somebody's really producing a public service announcement, we need to teach kids what is a good audio clip. How do you produce an audio clip? How do you make good sound, for example? If we're producing a real environmental impact statement, we need to tell them what's really needed. How do we really research? The last one that I would start with is the real world product, a public service announcement to go on the radio, an environmental impact statement. Anything that looks like is in the real world meets that criteria. I like to start in those 4 middle boxes. The other way you can use this tool is to start on the horizontal green boxes and to look at what is your school, what is your system demanding that students know, benchmarks to assess. What is your school asking to be the outcome of an education? And on the far right-hand side, what do students need to know to be able to accomplish this? For example, if students are doing a radio announcement, they need to know how to produce radio. They need to know how to produce audio clips. You will have this performance task creator in there. There's notes, right? There's parentheses which help you figure this out. And I'm always available via WhatsApp or email if you want help with this. But this is a powerful tool to use. I'm going to share with you something else, the innovation playlist. I'm going to give you a link to this at the very end, but the innovation playlist has a lot of resources around authentic assessments, including videos that are really helpful. This is what schools could be, that second resource there. So now in a second, this will be shared with you. You will have tons and tons of resources to help you do this. These resources are there in the Google slide. I'm sharing all of these with you. Here's resource page number 2, resource page number 3, resource page number 4, resource page number 5. I've done a lot of legwork for you, so you have a library of resources on authentic assessment. I will also share with you models for authentic assessment that work. But actually, before that, I want to go back to one quick thing. This article for me is amazing. I'm sure many of you are here because you like the science and art of teaching. This article for me really helped me understand what an authentic assessment is. And what they did with this article is they looked at many studies. You can see along the left-hand column, these are all the authors who've written about authentic assessment. And they use this to come up with the criteria of what is a great authentic assessment. It also shows you, where is this one here? So if you are a language arts teacher, if you teach language arts, a language, you can see here, there are certain authors who have written about authentic assessments in language arts. There are certain authors who've written about authentic assessments in foreign language acquisition, in science, in social studies, in math, in physical education, in fine arts, and with younger students in preschool. All of these articles are cited at the bottom of this main article. So you can go and Google this and go find all of the amazing research that's available, not just general research about authentic assessments, but specific to the topic that you are looking at. You can also see here the gray box means that author wrote about authentic assessments with regards to realistic activity or context, as well as formative assessment and knowing the students' developmental criteria. This article was transformative in my practice for authentic assessment. Tons of resources for you. I did this workshop, but live with teachers. And what I asked them to do is sit and listen to me up to this point. It's been 34 minutes up to this point. I asked them to listen to this. Then I gave them this PowerPoint, and I gave them an hour to look through the resources and come up with their own authentic assessment. I asked them to summarize everything they had heard me say and from the resources that I've provided, and then explain to their peers what they thought an authentic assessment was. You can tell I did this in Hawaii, where I'm from. There's a lot of Hawaiian things here, if you're familiar with Hawaii. One of the groups did the authentic assessment. What is an authentic assessment? Using the metaphor of a coconut tree. That authentic assessments have learning opportunities for reflection, as they're student focused, they are applicable, they have an authentic audience, they use multiple forms of assessment. Another group decided that enchiladas were their metaphor. and put all the different ingredients that needed to go into an authentic assessment: collaboration, parts of learning, long-term impact. Other groups use these different ways of explaining what an authentic assessment is. Why did I share these with you? Because they're ways that teachers, just like yourselves, have taken the information I've presented, taken the resources that I'm sharing with you here, and have allowed this to grow in their schools. So sitting here with me for 50 minutes today is not going to make this happen in your schools. What I would propose at this point is that you would lead your co-teachers, your schools, or yourselves in an authentic assessment of authentic assessments. Could you take the material here and to create your own one-pager that says, in your context, in your school, how do you take everything that I've shared with you and develop your own definition of authentic assessment? I'm going to do one more thing before we take questions, because what I want to do is really make this relevant to you and answer your questions. What I'm going to ask you to do is right now, if the moderators haven't yet shared the Google Slides with you, if they could share the Google Slides with you, what I'd like you to do is have the Google Slides and click on that link. When you click on that link, it'll take you to the webpage of what school could be. I'm an advisor for this group, and what I'd like you to do is actually right now, during our session, is to click on Request to Join. What it'll do is it'll give you access to the What School Could Be community, and many teachers just like yourselves from all around the world working on these types of projects, sitting here and listening to me for 40 minutes, and then wanting to apply this in school. It's a community of people you can ask questions to, and you can share your learning with. It is your authentic audience. And we shouldn't have sat through 40 minutes of this like we have right now without me giving you an authentic audience. What School Could Be is a community that will be our authentic audience that will help you learn along with each other and with me. So on that, I'm going to go back to this slide here, and I will actually I'll stop sharing, and I'll take your questions at this point.
Could you paste the link here in the chat box so that everybody could just access it directly?
Yeah. Let me see if I can do that for you.
I have typed it though, I think, community.whatschoolcouldbe.org. Okay, we got it, sir.
Yep. I'm going to copy the link for the whole presentation. I'm going to put it in the chat box now, and then I'd like for you to try to access it. And if you have problems, because a lot of there's sharing issues, you can let me know, and I will give you access. You can request access, and I will grant access to that. Right now, it should be open for everybody without specific access, but I've noticed in the past, as people click on it, for some Google domains it works, for other Google domains it doesn't work. So tell me, what are your questions right now? And if you can't access it, just click request access, and I will I'll authorize access for you right now for that. What are your questions?
Yes, sir, we have sent request.
All right. So take a second, join the community in whatschoolcouldbe.org, and then see if you can get onto that Google Docs presentation there. If you can get onto it, great. If you can't, let me know, and by requesting access, and I'll make sure you have access there. While we do that, what are your questions for me? What are your questions that you have for me?
So participants, please feel free to either type in the chat box or unmute yourself and ask your questions. So I would just like to make maybe a remark here that I could see that all the points, most of the points that you have mentioned relate very well to the project-based learning, where there is a real life problem, where there is a live audience who cares about what is being done by the students, where there is an ongoing assessment, where there is an ongoing correction also. This is not from a textbook. So is there a difference, or maybe can we simply say that this is one kind of an authentic assessment? A project-based learning is an authentic assessment. What
So
other words could
go
we
ahead.
use? Yes, sir, please
Yeah,
answer.
so this is a great question. Is authentic assessment and project-based learning the same thing? In certain aspects, they overlap significantly.
Right.
Authentic assessment is a way to assess learning. Now, project-based learning, you can do a project without a robust authentic assessment. Students can, in your classroom, you can give them a challenge. It can be a real world challenge. They can create something and they can turn it in just to you. That's a decent project, but to be a great authentic, you would want to go back and look at that project, the performance task, and make sure that we have all of those boxes checked off, that there is an authentic audience that cares about this. Many times, project-based learning stops short of having authentic assessments. Now, you can put an authentic assessment in a project-based learning, and so it's a little bit of a Venn diagram. Project-based learning is it's a larger system, a structure that learning can happen in, and project-based learning could culminate in an authentic assessment or not. So authentic assessment is a structure that fits within project-based learning. Now, authentic assessment could also fit outside of project-based learning. You don't need to be doing a project to do an authentic assessment. You could be teaching fairly standard things in your classroom because your school, your principal, whoever it is, doesn't allow you to do a lot of project-based learning. You could teach about a book, for example, a piece of literature or math skills. And you could do that using the textbook. You could do that using a website. You could do that using whatever resources you have at your available, not having it be a project-based learning. And you could still culminate that in an authentic assessment. Hope that helps. What other questions do you have?
Thank you, sir. And I could see that a similar question has been typed by our vice principal. So maybe we think alike. Other participants? So there is a question by Mr. Gregory. In the times that we are in, how could we assess students in the times of online learning? Some more ways, please.
Right. So in the times of online learning, so at the school I'm at right now, when we knew online was inevitable, one of the big questions we had is, how are we going to know if kids really did this work? And we decided that we were going to look for things where we could have students defend their learning and then also have students, okay, so this is what we decided. We were going to look for things where students needed to present authentic learning for two reasons. One is to authenticate it and make sure it was their own, and the other is to get the tangential benefit of that, in that it causes metacognition, right? So, for example, you do a test. You have the end of unit test that you always do in your math class. Great, but you do that online. Unless you're going to proctor it, where you can actually sit there and watch each student take it, unless you have a great internet system that can proctor and watch all of these things to make sure cheating doesn't happen, online learning is very difficult to authenticate learning. When students have to do something of their own, when they're creating something, it doesn't by definition demand that it's their own work. A student could have somebody else create their project, create the public service announcement. There's two things there. One is it's a process. And two is that part of a good authentic assessment is that a student then has to defend their learning. They need to present it. They need to, in the moment, write about it and reflect about it. So that defense of learning helps us authenticate it, that it's their own work. The other part of that question was, are there other structures besides authentic assessment that help us understand or help us meet the challenges of online learning? Definitely. We've been really thinking about this a lot. So we firmly have found, we've found a lot of success in projects. We found a lot of success in authentic assessment. We've also found a lot of success in self-paced learning that culminate in really small tasks. For example, while we don't find that the big test and the big essay is working well for us because it's so high stakes. There's so many points involved in it that students are cheating a lot on it. We found that the small end of lesson task, the exit tickets, before you leave our Zoom session, you need to write for me right now 2 takeaways and email it to me right now. Before the end of your homework tonight, you need to answer these 2 questions. And so I can understand if you got it or not. What we found is that reducing the stakes, taking it from high stakes to low stakes, has allowed students to engage with those very simple assessments that we were doing before, right? In a way that they're more willing to do it authentically, because answering 2 questions is less of a risk than taking a giant final exam. And now we have more information from day to day on our kids getting what we're teaching them online. So we start with the point that I made. It's not what we teach, it's what kids learn. These smaller, more traditional assessments of an exit ticket, write what you understand, 2 questions of a quick quiz, we have seen being much more efficient and effective than the really big traditional assessments in the time of COVID and online learning. What else do we have?
Right, sir. So we have a few questions, and I would request these participants to unmute themselves and ask. Before that, I would ask you to explain to us how the assessments could be linked to learning objectives, how authentic assessments could be linked to learning outcomes.
Right. So I'm gonna tell you the tool that I would use, and then I'll explain it a little bit. The tool I would use is that performance task creator. So one of the ways that you can start doing this, and all of those boxes should really be filled in on that performance task creator. I suggested maybe you start in the middle. Another place to start is to start in that far left-hand column and say, right now in this unit, right now in this month, right now in this week, these are the learning objectives I need to cover. And if we write them down and we look at them, what I typically have teachers do is prioritize them. What are the ones that we see are most important? In a unit that's a month long, we may have 5, 10, 15, even more learning objectives. You can't assess all of those. Yeah, you can't assess all of those in an authentic assessment. We need to focus on the ones that are of the highest value. By writing, if you're in a school that needs to start with the learning objectives because you're preparing kids for an exit exam, because you have these requirements from your school system, I would always suggest that you start with that left-hand column on the performance task creator. Write down right now in this unit, what are the objectives we need to cover? And then start from there and say, okay, so in the real world, what do these learning objectives look like? Why are they important? And how do they play out in the real world? How would we really use these? For example, in language arts, right? Writing and reading. A lot of the objectives for writing and reading don't talk about application. But why do we need to learn to read well? Why do we need to learn to be persuasive in our writing? So one of the objectives might be persuasive writing, that we can persuade people with the tool of rhetoric, for example, right? And so that's one of the learning objectives, that I can persuade people using the tool of rhetoric. And if that's my starting place on this far left-hand column, I would then sit around and I would build the inside of that performance task, knowing that my performance task needs to accomplish this goal. My performance task needs to have students actually persuading people with the tool of rhetoric. And then I would think of who needs to be persuaded. What a real world issue could we persuade somebody about? And how can writing persuade that real person?
I think that's a brilliant explanation, sir. I would now request Mr. Willibrod George to ask his question.
Very quickly, based on that definition, would you say that any examination that is done by a board or any standardized test could, in a way be called authentic assessment because it's done by the student themselves and without any help?
So I would say probably no, right? I would say that it might be authentic in the sense of they need to do it themselves and there's an external audience outside of that. But I would go back to one of the other criteria, is that it needs to be more than being about the grade. An authentic assessment should do two things that most standardized tests don't do. They should impact the real world outside of the classroom. And that's part of the spark of internal motivation, right? That's part of the spark of intrinsic motivation. And the other thing that they should do is be about more than the grade. Like that Ebola example, kids wanted to come back and make it better. Most kids don't want to come back and make their exam better unless they did poorly, and it counts for something, right? For the grade. But if you take away the grade from a final exam, most kids are fine just leaving it the way it is, right? And so I think a final exam doesn't meet at least two of those criteria. It's about the grade, and it doesn't really impact anybody outside of the classroom. Now, I think that there are some good things about final exams. It does put the teacher in a coaching position with kids, and it is something that they care about outside of that. There's room for a final exam, but there's also room for authentic assessments. And the reason why is specifically in an age of COVID, it's hard to authenticate final exams. Kids are going to come in, that's one thing. Two, final exams very much, for the most part, don't activate metacognition and reflection. We leave the learning on the table there. We don't typically take it with us. Studies have shown that kids who get 100%, 90% on an end of the year final tend the next year to have forgotten so much of it that they would not have passed the very next year over the summer. So they're leaving all of that on the table. And if we really want our societies to move forward, I would say the highest benchmark here is that we have to have kids not just skilled and knowledgeable, but they need to be creative, critical thinkers, collaborators. They need to address the problems of today. And that's one thing that final exams don't do. That's not me saying final exams don't have a place, right? That's me saying final exams shouldn't be the only way we assess, because certainly they are lacking in major things.
That's a beautiful question by Mr. Will. Actually, in the initial slides where you showed the difference between traditional assessment and authentic assessment, it became very clear that authenticity is not just about ensuring that the child has honestly done the examination, but it is to check how honestly the learning has happened, whether the learning has happened or not, and whether it is applicable to the real world or not. So thank you so much for the question and this amazing answer. So there is a question by Miss Nagma. If she is still in the meeting, Miss Nagma, I request you to kindly ask your question. Unmute yourself, followed by Mr. Gregory. And there is a remark by Mr. Pushpendra. Meanwhile, I read this remark. A performance task is any learning activity or assessment that asks students to perform to demonstrate their knowledge, understanding, and proficiency.
Can you read that again?
A performance task is any learning activity or assessment that asks students to perform to demonstrate their knowledge, understanding, and proficiency.
Yes, a performance task is that. That's an excellent definition of a performance task. I think, again, if you look at that article that I shared, the one that I said helped me really form my thinking of it, that had all the authors down the side, one of the things that they share in that article is no one really agrees. There's no agreement in the world of education. What is a performance task and not an authentic assessment? What is an authentic assessment and not a performance task? And what the overlap is. There's not agreement there in the world of education. What we do know is that there are great performance tasks and there's junk performance tasks. There's great authentic assessments and there's junk authentic assessments. And where an authentic assessment is a performance task and a performance task is an authentic assessment, when kids are doing these things and showing their learning, bringing something into being, and checking off all of the criteria for an authentic assessment, that's where we have the most power for learning.
Right, right. Mr. Greg, would you like to ask your question?
I think he said he got his answer, I think.
Right.
Yes.
And anyway, what I see here is, his question was, could hands-on learning be completely authentic assessment? So I think learning and assessment are two different things.
Say that again, hands-on learning be what?
His question is, could hands-on learning be completely authentic assessments?
So authentic assessment should be hands-on, right? Again, this is one of those Venn diagrams where there's an overlap. Authentic assessment by definition must be hands-on learning to a certain extent, not every time, all the time. You can have not hands-on learning, that culminates in an authentic assessment, but the authentic assessment itself would have hands-on. And good hands-on learning should culminate in something that's authentic. Now, you could do hands-on learning and not culminate into an authentic assessment. You could learn by doing, and then you could assess the knowledge that was gained in a test. One example is kids going to the fish pond that I talked about in the very first example. People were going to this fish pond, this fish reserve, learning by doing, and then coming back to school and doing a traditional test and a traditional essay. That contrast was having kids not like school even more, even though they really liked the hands-on learning. And because the learning wasn't being assessed using an authentic assessment, there was a dissonance there. It didn't connect. And so the teachers sat around and said, hey, you know what, this dissonance means that we want them to write something, but we want that writing to be authentic. Hence, creating an authentic assessment to assess the hands-on learning.
So may I give an example?
Yes, please go ahead, Greg.
Namaste, sir. Namaste, ma'am. This is regarding grade 1. While teaching them the instruction text, how to make tea. So they actually made the tea along with their family members. Okay, they were supervised by the family members. They did it. They applied all the steps and all the ingredients that they required to make it. Later, they posted, they written down those notes in their notebooks. And while the class was on physically, online, they did speak about it. So is it, does it count in authentic assessment, sir?
I would say, not having all the details, I would say probably. That sounds like an amazing thing, right? If we're learning about this thing here, whatever the content is, wherever it comes from, the textbook, an article, a resource that you need to cover with those skills and content knowledges that you know you need to cover, and you're going to ask kids to do something real with it, that's great. I think that kids making tea, what to me is an authentic assessment to show that they got the skills and the content of making tea. Now, was one of the outcomes beyond the making of the tea? Was there something else they needed to understand? And maybe did they present that to their parents, for example? Did they tell their parents, we're going to do this, we're going to make tea in this way because I learned this? One of the things that happens a lot in authentic assessments is that students try to change attitudes of other people. That's a great authentic assessment. So instead of just doing a poster about why we should recycle, actually try to see, how much is your family recycling now? Let's weigh what you're recycling, and then go home and explain to your family why recycling is important, and see if you can go home and show them different ways to recycle. And then at the end, weigh how much you're recycling then and see if you can move the needle, so to speak, actually change behavior. That's a small example, but I've seen a lot of teachers in schools use that change behavior, change attitudes test of a good and authentic assessment.
I think that this is a good compass to see whether we are following authenticity in the assessments. I would just like to emphasize on this fact that the example that Mr. Gregory gave was with the learning objective of making the students understand what is an instructional text, how to understand that a text is instructional by nature, that they start understanding how to give instructions, how to understand instructions. An instruction begins with a verb, and so on. So, like sir said, he heard the question. He thought that the objective was to make the children learn how to make tea, but the learning objective was to understand what instruction is all about, how is an instructional text is written, and what is the role of a verb, why is it used in the beginning. So I think this is how we can check authenticity, if he has become better at understanding instructions and at giving instructions, etc. Am I right, sir?
What a brilliant example. Brilliant example.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
We are, I think, 1 minute from being done. And one of the things I'd like to do before I leave the chat is make sure that those of you who I haven't added to the presentation yet, I copy your email addresses and add you to the presentation. There's a lot of resources there. I'm going to do that now. And on that, I just want to thank you all for having me. This is amazing. You have my contact information there. Feel free to reach out at any time. I'm on Twitter, I'm on Instagram, and you can email me or WhatsApp me at any time if you have any questions on how to implement this. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
So could you please write down your email ID for the sake of others who might like to communicate with you on this further? And I wish bring to your attention this beautiful closing remark, I would say, by Mr. Willibrord, this paves the way for authentic teaching. So I think this was the overall biggest learning objective of today's session, was to understand that authentic learning comes from authentic coaching or teaching. If we start thinking in that way, the assessments are going to become authentic.
Excellent. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. I'm going to stay online for a little bit just to upload the email addresses. You should have access to that Google slide. Thank you so much.
Right. And from the school also, from Ramratna International School, we have made a note of all the email IDs for the participants outside of RRIS. And we will share whatever material we have received from Dr. Kapono.
Excellent. Actually, you know what would be really helpful? If you could send me everybody's email addresses in one document. That way I don't miss. But would you do that? And
we'll do that.
Wonderful. Thank you guys
so much. We are going to share with you. And thank you for being in Aadharshila. In Hindi, this is a Hindi word which means the foundation stone. So you have become one of the foundation stones for the culture that we try to build in our school. Thank you so much. We look forward to your continued guidance and mentorship. Thank you for being in Aadharshila.
Thank you. Namaste. Thank you so much.
You all the best. Namaste, sir. Thank you. And thanks to all the participants for making this session a participatory one, an interactive one. See you next Monday, and the Monday after that, and the Monday after that, and after that. Thank you so much for giving your love and motivation to Aadharshila Talks at Ramratna International School. On behalf of my RRIS family, this is Dr. Jaya Parekh, the principal of RRIS, bowing down in gratitude. Salute to all the teachers here for being the pillars of strength to all the children in these difficult times. See you next Monday. Thanks once again